All right, let's dive into a really fascinating piece of religious history. In this explainer, we're going to look at how our source material explains the very unique origins of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's a global faith that, according to this analysis, was born directly from a prophecy that spectacularly failed.
So let me kick things off with a wild question. What happens when tens of thousands of people are absolutely convinced the world is ending on a specific day, and then it just doesn't? This isn't some hypothetical. This is the very real, very human origin story we're exploring today.
To even wrap your head around how this could happen, you've got to go back to the early 1800s in America. This time was known as the Second Great Awakening, and it was just this explosion of spiritual revival. People were fired up, they were questioning old religious authorities, and they felt this intense personal duty to get ready for the end times. It was the perfect storm for a radical new message to take hold.
And that message, it came from a really unlikely source, a farmer from upstate New York named William Miller. This first part of our story is all about his prophecy and how it completely captivated a nation.
So, you're probably wondering, how on earth did a farmer come up with such a specific, world-ending prophecy? Well, Miller wasn't just pulling ideas out of thin air. He was a former deist, meaning he prized logic and reason. He came up with this very rigid, systematic set of rules to decode the Bible, treating it almost like a divine puzzle. He was convinced that if you just applied his rules consistently, all its secrets could be unlocked.
And the absolute key, the linchpin to his entire system, was this: the day-year principle. The idea is pretty simple, actually. Whatever a biblical prophecy mentions a day, he believed it was really code for one literal year. Now, he didn't invent this, but the way he applied it with such mathematical precision felt brand new and incredibly convincing.
And here's where he put that principle into action. Miller zeroed in on a verse in the book of Daniel that said a sanctuary would be cleansed after 2,300 days. So he applies his day for a year logic, and suddenly that's 2,300 years. He traces the starting point back to 457 BC, does the math, and lands on a conclusion that would change everything. Christ was coming back to cleanse the earth in 1844.
After an earlier prediction didn't pan out, the movement doubled down on this one single definitive date: October 22nd, 1844. You really can't overstate the excitement and the urgency. The sources tell us that up to 100,000 followers, called Millerites, sold their farms, they left their jobs, all gathering together, literally waiting for the sky to part.
Which brings us to the dramatic, heartbreaking climax of this whole movement, the Great Disappointment. The name says it all, really.
Just listen to this account from Hiram Edson, one of the believers. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted. I mean, you can feel the devastation in those words. This wasn't just about being wrong. For these people, it was a profound, soul-crushing event. Their entire reality, their faith, their community, it all just crumbled in a single 24-hour period. The sun came up on October 23rd. The world was exactly as it had been. And just like that, the Millerite movement shattered. Most of the followers, humiliated and heartbroken, just gave up and went home. And honestly, the story should have ended right there.
But it didn't. See, for a small, hardcore group of believers, just walking away wasn't an option. They had bet everything on this. They just refused to believe that the date itself was a mistake. And that intense crisis of faith is what led to a radical, new vision. This slide shows the incredible theological pivot that saved everything. The very next morning, Hiram Edson claimed he had this vision while walking through his cornfield. He thought, what if Miller was right about the date, but just wrong about the event? What if the cleansing of the sanctuary wasn't about the earth at all? What if it was about Christ beginning a new kind of work inside a sanctuary in heaven? And just like that, the date was rescued. Failure was brilliantly reframed as a misunderstood success. Now, an idea is one thing, but building a church takes leaders. Our source argues that these three key figures took that new insight and built a movement around it. You had Joseph Bates, a former sea captain who brought in the idea of Saturday Sabbath worship. You had James White, a master organizer who built the publishing houses and the church structure. And then you had his wife, Ellen White, whose prophetic visions were seen as divine confirmation, God's stamp of approval on these new doctrines. Okay, so this brings us to the absolute core of the argument from our source material. The unique doctrines that make up Seventh-day Adventism aren't just a random collection of beliefs. They were developed as a coherent, interlocking system, all designed to do one thing: support that new interpretation of the 1844 date.
If you look at this table, you can see just how different these new ideas were. Compared to most Christians at the time, the early Adventist positions on the Sabbath, on judgment, on prophecy, and even on what happens when you die, they were all major departures. And the analysis we're looking at says they aren't separate ideas. They're all pieces of a single, carefully constructed puzzle.
So you have to ask, how do these things even connect, right? How do you get from a failed end-of-the-world prophecy in 1844 to a belief about worshiping on Saturday or about souls being asleep after death?
Well, here's how the source argues it all fits together like clockwork. First, the investigative judgment was the new heavenly event that made the 1844 date correct. Second, Ellen White's prophecies gave that radical new doctrine divine authority. Third, the Saturday Sabbath gave this small, struggling group a unique identity and a new urgent mission. And finally, soul sleep. The idea that the dead are just unconscious became necessary. Why? Well, think about it. You can't have an investigation of the dead starting in 1844 if their souls are already in heaven or hell.
So the source's conclusion is pretty stark. It argues that the very DNA of early Adventist theology wasn't just a straightforward reading of the Bible. It was a systematic, pragmatic, and honestly, an incredibly creative response to a catastrophic crisis. It was like building a theological fortress to protect that one single sacred date from collapsing.
And that leaves us with a final thought, one that goes way beyond this one story. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often are our own strongest beliefs, whether they're personal or political or spiritual, forged not in moments of calm certainty, but in that desperate human need to make sense of a crisis?